Jesus is sentenced to death. At first Jesus was taken to the house of Caiaphas, who was the chief priest, and there with the other members of the court. They tried to make Jesus say something against God, but they could not. Then they brought in several people to tell lies about Jesus, but because these people were liars, they said different things about Jesus. They could not agree among themselves. This made the chief priest and his friends look silly. So next they decided to question Jesus about all he had said and done. Jesus asked why they were doing this now. Anyone could have come to hear him while he was teaching and talking to people in the open. He never hid anything. They could have found out everything about him then. For most of the time, Jesus said nothing. Then they asked him all sorts of questions and said bad things about him. He wouldn't speak to them. But when they asked, "Are you the specially chosen servant of God, Son of God?" he answered, "I am, and you will see that it is so." The chief priest then stood up to show how angry he was. He tore his own clothing. He said to everyone else, "We do not need witnesses now. He has insulted our God. This man claims he is God." That, the chief priest thought, was a very evil thing to do. "What should we do with him?" he asked. They answered, "Now he must die." Then they started spitting at Jesus, and they put a blindfold on him and beat him with their fists. They said, "Be a prophet, specially chosen one of God. Tell us which one of us hit you." And they made fun of Jesus. Now Peter was in the courtyard of the chief priest's house, looking through the open door. He could see Jesus inside. He could see people mocking him by spitting at him, hitting him with their fists. He was scared in case he'd be caught too, and perhaps also beaten and killed. But he didn't want to leave Jesus because he had promised never to let him down. Jesus had sadly told him, "Before the cock crows in the morning, you'll pretend 3 times that you never knew me." It was very cold, nearly morning, and the fire was burning in the courtyard. Peter was sitting by the fire, warming himself. Suddenly a servant of the chief priest pointed at him. "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" he said to Peter. He was frightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, and he ran and hid in the shadow of the gateway. But another servant saw him. He was related to the man whose ear Peter had cut off, so she had good reason to remember him. "Didn't I see you in the olive garden with Jesus?" she said. "No," cried Peter, "I don't know him." Soon everybody was crowding round him. "Of course you were with Jesus," they said. "You came from the same place he does. We can tell by the way you walk." To try to stop them saying these things, Peter began to say the most hateful words against Jesus. At that moment he heard a cock crow because it was morning. Peter remembered that Jesus said to him, and he cried. The elders who had been questioning Jesus decided to take him to Pontius Pilate, the man who governed them on behalf of Caesar. The chief priest and the other enemies of Jesus said he'd been telling everyone to rise up and fight against the Romans. They said Jesus told people not to pay money to the Romans. They said Jesus was saying he was the king of the Jews. Pontius Pilate asked Jesus if he did claim to be king. Jesus answered, "I have a kingdom, but it's not of this world. All I wish to do here is tell people the truth." Pilate asked, "What is the truth?" But he believed Jesus was not as bad as Jesus' enemies said. Pontius Pilate thought the best thing to do was to have Jesus beaten and then let go. Pilate tried to get out of judging Jesus. Since Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him there to be tried by a man who ran Galilee at the time. The man was called Herod and happened to be in Jerusalem. But Jesus would say nothing to Herod, so Herod got his guards to make fun of Jesus while Herod watched and joined in. They pretended to dress him as a king, and they sent him back to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate still wanted to set Jesus free. He had an idea for doing this. Every year at the time of the feast of Passover, Pilate would set free a prisoner. Hoping this would please the Jews, he decided to ask the crowd outside whether he should set Jesus free or the criminal called Barabbas, who had stole from people and killed them. He knew that Jesus' enemies had brought Jesus to him because they were jealous, So Pontius Pilate took Jesus out to the crowd and asked, "Shall I set free Jesus, or shall I set free Barabbas?" Jesus' enemies ruined Pilate's plan to set Jesus free. They went among the crowd and made everyone shout, "Set Barabbas free!" Pilate asked the crowd, "What shall I do with Jesus?" Jesus' enemies wanted Jesus killed by nailing him to a cross until he died. They called, "Crucifixion!" They mingled with the crowd and shouted, "Crucify him!" Pontius Pilate did not like this. He knew Jesus was a good man. He took a bowl of water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. He wanted to show them that he wasn't the one who was having Jesus killed. His hands were clean. The crowd shouted, "We'll take the blame for killing Jesus." And so Pontius Pilate gave the order that Jesus was to be crucified.